The living exhibit. Daniel Morrison pushed open the museum door just as the rain intensified. Not the kind of rain that demanded urgency, but persistent enough to make staying outside feel unreasonable. He'd passed this building 100 times, never once considering stepping inside. Museums were for people who had something worth remembering. The lobby was silent and cold, smelling of dust and sterility, not the decay of age, but the emptiness of spaces where nothing happened. The ticket counter sat abandoned. No one asked for admission. He simply walked past it into the first gallery. Exhibits lined the walls with geometric precision. Paintings, sculptures, objects under glass with small bronze plaques. Daniel read the names automatically, but they dissolved in his mind before taking shape. Everything blurred into the same pale backdrop. He felt that familiar irritation rising, the same numbness that greeted him every morning at work. Life continued, he realized, but without his actual participation. The second gallery was quieter still. Only the dull hum of air conditioning broke the silence. He approached a glass case in the center of the room. Inside lay an ordinary office chair, indistinguishable from the one he sat on every single day. The placard beneath it was blank. He stared at it for longer than necessary. "That's strange," he muttered, moving on. But something had shifted. The museum no longer felt like a refuge from the rain. It felt like something else entirely, though he couldn't name it yet. In the third gallery, Daniel noticed the visitors. 2 men and a woman stood at a distance, barely moving. They weren't looking at the exhibits. They were looking at him. He acknowledged them with a nod, a polite gesture between strangers in a public space. None of them responded. It was only when the woman tilted her head, as if reading fine print on a distant placard, that Daniel understood. They weren't studying him casually. They were studying him intently, methodically, the way one examines a specimen. "Excuse me," he said, turning to face them directly. His voice sounded smaller than expected in the vast room. The woman said nothing. The man beside her leaned close and whispered something Daniel couldn't hear. The other man nodded. Together, they turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing down the corridor with unnatural synchronization. Daniel's heart accelerated more than the situation warranted. He forced a smile, telling himself they were simply eccentric tourists. Museums always attracted the strange. He noticed an audio guide hanging on a hook near the entrance. Headphones, dated equipment, the kind of thing he'd normally ignore. But something made him reach for them. He hesitated, then pressed play. "Welcome," said a neutral voice, neither male nor female. "You are currently in the Hall of Voluntary Cessation." Daniel froze. "Please examine the exhibits carefully," the voice continued. They offered no resistance. "What the—" He yanked the headphones off, but the voice continued, tinny and distant, still emanating from the device in his hands. "Exhibit number 47 remains in the active phase. We request that you do not interact." He dropped the headphones. They clattered against the floor. The voice cut off abruptly. His pace quickened as he moved deeper into the museum. The galleries began to transform. The layout no longer matched the map he'd glimpsed at the entrance. New corridors appeared. New doorways. New names painted on the walls in elegant script. The Hall of Postponement. The Hall of the Resigned. The Hall of Compromise. Each name felt like a key turning in a lock, unlocking something in Daniel's chest he didn't want opened. The rooms seemed to multiply, each one smaller and more intimate than the last. The light grew dimmer. The silence grew deeper. In one gallery, a display case held a backpack. His backpack. He recognized it immediately, the zipper scarred from years of use, a keychain hanging from the outer pocket. A keychain he'd bought in university, one he'd never removed, always meaning to when he had time. The placard read, "Personal effects. Stage, early." Daniel stepped backward slowly, as if distance might change what he was seeing. "This isn't real," he whispered to the empty room. "This isn't possible." But even as he said it, he knew it was. The museum wasn't showing him objects from his life. It was showing him his life as objects. And somewhere in the building, there was a placard with his name on it. Daniel ran. Each door opened into a new gallery, each one more personal than the last. The number of visitors increased. They stood motionless in their designated spaces, arranged like furniture, their eyes following him with an expression he'd seen 1,000 times before, the polite disinterest of people observing something that no longer mattered. The Hall of Deferred Dreams. A display of university diplomas in frames, each one gathering dust, each one representing a different path not taken. Beside them, job application rejection letters, perfectly preserved behind glass. The Hall of Small Compromises. A timeline of decisions made not because they were right, but because they were acceptable. Accept the job offer. Accept the apartment. Accept the relationship that wasn't quite love but wasn't quite emptiness either. Accept, accept, accept. The Hall of Years. A calendar frozen on a single date, 10 years ago, with pages turning invisibly forward, each one identical to the last. Daniel's breathing became ragged. He pushed through another door, hoping for an exit, but found himself in a vast atrium lined with thousands of display cases. Inside each one sat a person. Or had been a person. They stood in poses of perfect stillness, their expressions blank, their clothes outdated or timeless, it was hard to tell which. Some wore business suits. Others wore pajamas. A few wore clothes from decades past. They all looked at him as he passed. One woman's eyes followed him across the room. A man's jaw twitched slightly, was it a greeting or a warning? A child in a small case tilted its head with an expression of profound sadness. "No," Daniel whispered. "No, no, no." He kept moving, running now, his footsteps echoing off marble floors that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. The galleries blurred together. Names painted on walls became a fevered dream of accusation. Hall of acceptable mediocrity. Hall of things left unsaid. Hall of the almost. Then, suddenly, silence. He stumbled into a final gallery, nearly empty except for a single glass case positioned in the center of the room. Daniel approached it slowly, half hoping, half dreading that he'd misunderstood everything. Inside the case was nothing. Or rather, the case appeared empty. But in front of it stood a placard, and on that placard was text. Daniel read it from a distance first, hoping the words might change if he didn't look too closely. Daniel turned slowly. A man in museum uniform stood in the doorway, his clothes bearing no name tag, no identification of any kind. He looked neither old nor young, neither kind nor cruel. He simply existed, the way institutional things exist, present but not quite real. "What is this place?" Daniel's voice cracked. "What are you?" The curator stepped forward with measured movements. "Does it matter? You've known for some time, haven't you? You simply hadn't found the gallery that displayed it." "I'm not," Daniel began, but the words dissolved. He was not what? Alive? That seemed too dramatic. Dead? He didn't feel dead. He felt exactly the way he'd felt for 10 years, present but absent, existing but not experiencing. Stay, the curator said simply. It's quiet here. There's no pain in stillness. Pain only comes when you're still trying. Daniel looked around the empty gallery. In its emptiness, he could see a kind of peace. No more choices. No more the weight of unchosen alternatives. No more the small daily humiliations of work, of compromise, of being a person whose presence or absence made no difference. And if I leave? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. The curator shrugged, a gesture so perfectly indifferent that it contained no comfort. Then you become lost. We don't search for the lost. There's no catalogue for them. They exist outside the museum's inventory. You mean I'll just disappear? You disappeared a long time ago, the curator said. The difference now is that you'll know it. Daniel stood. His legs felt uncertain, as if they belonged to someone else. Through the gallery's high windows, he could see the street outside. The rain had stopped. People moved past the museum without looking at it. They were hurrying to places that mattered to them, carrying purposes that extended beyond themselves. He thought of the office chair with its blank placard. He thought of his university keychain, never removed, never acknowledged. He thought of all the small moments when he could have chosen differently, spoken up, walked away, demanded more from himself, and instead had simply accepted the next compromise, the next postponement, the next year. The curator watched him with eyes that held no judgment because judgment would have required caring about the outcome. I'm going to leave, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. As you wish, the curator replied. Daniel walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed through the empty gallery. Each step felt like a decision, but he knew better now. Decisions required alternatives, and he'd run out of those long ago. He was simply moving now, that was all. Simply continuing in the direction momentum had already chosen for him. The doors at the end of the corridor opened onto the street. The rain had stopped. The city was precisely as it had been, indifferent, continuing, waiting for no one. Daniel stepped outside into the afternoon light. Behind him, he heard the museum doors close with a sound like finality. The street was exactly as he'd left it. Traffic moved in predictable patterns. Pedestrians flowed past each other without collision or acknowledgement. The cafe where he sometimes bought coffee was still there, the closed cinema still closed. Nothing had changed except that Daniel was no longer certain he had either. He walked for several minutes without direction. His apartment was one way. Work was another. The rain-soaked park where he sometimes sat was a third. He chose none of these paths. Instead, he found himself on the museum's opposite side, where he could see its entire facade. That's when he noticed the new placard. It was small, easily missed, affixed to the wall beside the service entrance. The bronze letters caught the late afternoon light. Exhibit No. 47, lost. Search not initiated. Daniel stared at it. He tried to feel something, anger, fear, despair. But the emotions wouldn't come. They required some core of belief to attach themselves to, and he'd surrendered that core somewhere in the museum's depths. A woman passed him on the sidewalk. She glanced at him, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no recognition in hers, no acknowledgement that he existed. She simply looked through him, the way one looks through glass, and continued walking. Then another person. And another. They moved around him as if he were an obstacle in their path, not something to be avoided, but something that didn't require acknowledgement. He was becoming translucent, a figure in the background of other people's stories. Daniel checked his reflection in the museum's glass doors. He could still see himself, which was somehow worse. Because he knew now what the curator had meant. He wasn't disappearing from the physical world. He was disappearing from the world of consequence, meaning, and notice. He was becoming what he'd been pretending to be for 10 years, invisible. His phone buzzed in his pocket. An email from work. A meeting tomorrow at 9. A project deadline. The message wasn't asking if he would attend, it was simply informing him that he would. His presence was assumed, required, and utterly inconsequential. He didn't bother reading the full email. Instead, Daniel turned back toward the museum one final time. The building looked different now, not sinister, but accepting. It had simply been telling the truth about something he'd known all along. The only difference was that now the truth was official. Now it was catalogued and labeled and preserved behind glass. He walked away from the museum, back toward the city's ordinary rhythm. No one watched him go. No one noticed him staying. 3 weeks passed. Daniel continued to exist in the spaces he'd always occupied. He went to work. He attended meetings where his contributions were noted but not remembered. He ate meals alone in his apartment, each one tasting of nothing in particular. He slept. He woke. He moved through the day as a series of required motions. No one noticed anything different about him. Or perhaps they noticed everything, and simply didn't care. He passed the museum occasionally on his way to nowhere in particular. Each time, he looked at it from across the street, wondering if the placard was still there. He never checked. Knowing it existed was enough. The museum had given him something he'd never had before, certainty. Certainty that he was already gone. One evening, as he walked past the cinema that had been closed for years, he saw a reflection in its darkened glass. For a moment, he thought it was his own. But when he turned, there was no one there. He looked back at the reflection. It was still visible, but fainter now. Each time he looked, it seemed to fade a little more. The museum had been right about one thing. There was no pain in stillness. There was no pain because there was nothing to be pained. Pain required consciousness, resistance, the belief that things could be different. And Daniel had finally surrendered all of that. He was exhibit number 47. But the museum's inventory was incomplete. Because Daniel Morrison was no longer catalogued there. He was everywhere now and nowhere. He was the man you passed on the street without seeing. He was the voice in the meeting you didn't quite remember. He was the person you looked through, the face you forgot immediately after meeting. The museum's final placard had been accurate. Search not initiated. Because no one had noticed he was missing. And that, somehow, was the most perfect ending of all, not a disappearance, but an erasure so complete that it was indistinguishable from having never existed at all. The rain began again, soft and persistent. Daniel walked on, invisible in the indifferent city, another exhibit in the great museum of the living.